Does anyone have any questions, just kind of burning questions that you want to try to get answered right away, as far as how the course works or anything like that? Yeah?
How about the timing of the course?
It'll be from 6:30 to 8:30 on the nights. The nights are posted on the web page. So those 5 nights. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then Lance will be. You're going to use that. But you're going to repeat questions as well. Yeah. Okay. All right, good evening. Hey, are we on? Test, test. Shay? Oh, there we go. All right. Good evening. Welcome to the Vancouver Aquarium's inaugural Introduction to Marine Life of BC course. Thanks for joining us tonight. Them into the YouTube comment section, or if you're here at the aquarium, you can raise your hand. And our speakers can answer some questions as we go, and then they'll also be available for answering questions during the break and after the class. We will try to stick to about 2 hours so that we can be timely and get everyone going as soon as they need to kind of move on and do other things. The class will end on November 18th. That'll be our last class. And then we might put together a ceremony at a later date. So we'll ask you to save a date towards the end of our presentation tonight. The group that is presenting is the Cetacean Research Lab here at the Vancouver Aquarium. And the Cetacean Research Lab has been studying killer whales and other cetaceans here in British Columbia for over 50 years. They have a breadth of knowledge and wealth of experience, headed by Dr. Lance Barrett-Lennard, who's been studying killer whales for quite some time now, and has been doing some very innovative new techniques to study killer whales, newer than the new ones that were new probably a dozen years ago or so. So it's quite exciting, and I think we're going to hear about some of that tonight. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Lance Barrett-Lennard.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you to everybody for coming out this evening. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and it's an exciting day for us. This is the first time we've done anything like this, and thanks to Jonathan for I think this was your brainchild, Jonathan, the whole idea of doing this course. So yeah, we'll see how it goes. And my name, as Jonathan mentioned, is Lance Barrett-Lennard. I head up the cetacean research program here. He was right on that. And I've been here for about 12 years, but I was associated with the aquarium for a number of years before that as a research associate, as a graduate student actually, and then after I finished my grad work, worked for the Fisheries and Oceans Department. So I go back over 20 years here. My mentor and my predecessor in my position, heading up our cetacean research program, was Dr. John Ford. He was my graduate supervisor or co-supervisor. And I just want to start this evening by making a plug for John's new book, and then we'll launch into the course. But here it is. It's called Marine Mammals of British Columbia. Very original title. This book was 25 years in the making. When I first met John, he was talking about writing this book. The father of killer whale biology in British Columbia, the guy who really got it started, the pioneer, in fact got systematic killer whale research going in the world, was Dr. Michael Bigg. He died in 1990, well ahead of his time, and John promised that he would write this book. Made that promise to Mike on his deathbed, and anyway, it's out. It came out about 2 weeks ago. It's a wonderful thing. You can give Jonathan, he doesn't know this, but you can give Jonathan your email address. Our Vancouver Aquarium gift store doesn't have it yet. It's that new. They'll have it within probably a few weeks. But if you give your email address to Jonathan, he'll pass it on to the gift store and they'll notify you. I think it's around $38 or something. It's a voluminous, incredibly meticulously researched, well-bound, portable. If you're on the internet, you can probably get this on Amazon sometime before too long. So without further ado, we'll launch into this. We're going to, we've divided the, shall I do the, here, move to the beginning here. Here we go, splash slide. This is what we're going to cover tonight. My assistant and the newest member of the lab and our research assistant and runner of our vital killer whale adoption program, Carla Crossman, will give the general overview of cetacean biology. Carla finished her master's degree at UBC a year or so ago. So she's well qualified to do this. Tess Danilesco will be next, talking about the particular set of cetacean species we have here in BC, and we're lucky to have a diverse fauna of cetaceans here. I'll go on and talk about killer whales, specifically, a lot of basic biology and some recent research findings. And then Chad Nordstrom, who's been with our lab as a research assistant for several years now, will do an overview of cetacean research at the Vancouver Aquarium. And that'll be quite a diverse presentation, I think. And then we'll do a quick set of conclusions. So without further ado, Carla.
So the evening's talk tonight, I guess this portion was called Whales, Dolphins, and Porpoises, but this really falls under that big umbrella of cetaceans. So when we talk about cetaceans, and we'll talk about them several times this evening, we're talking about that big group that includes all the whales, all the dolphins, all the porpoises, these river dolphins, sperm whales, belugas, narwhals, that whole inclusive group. Now, when we go back, we step back and we say, okay, what do these guys all have in common? Well, they all fall into that kingdom Animalia. This is the animal kingdom. They're vertebrates. They're also mammals. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, that these are marine mammals. They're not fish, and they all fall into that order Cetacea. So if you think back to biology a long, long time ago, this order Cetacea is a monophyletic group. So all of these whales, dolphins, and porpoises are more related to each other than they are to anything else. So this is really important. From this, we can break it down a little bit further. But these cetaceans, it's really just the whales, dolphins, and porpoises. These aren't including all marine mammals. We're not talking about sea lions. We're not talking about the pinnipeds and otters. They are a little bit separate, and those will come in a later week. So we have to step back millions and millions of years and go back to when life began in the ocean. But then terrestrial life and mammals actually evolved up on land. And it wasn't until things went back secondarily into the ocean that we had the evolution of cetaceans. So the furthest back, cetaceans have a common ancestor that's actually more related to the ungulates. So this was a hoofed-like creature, somewhat like a hyena in shape, that eventually moved back into the water and started to become a little bit more cetacean-like and evolve those cetacean characteristics that we know of and think of today, those long snouts, kind of a streamlined body shape, and eventually evolving the loss of limbs and the flippers and a fluke. Now, the cetaceans that we have here in BC, and all of the cetaceans in the world, fall into one of two big broad categories. They're either mysticetes, so these baleen whales, meaning that they're filter feeding. They're feeding from the roof of their mouth, hang these plates of baleen, and there's one on the table on the outside you can see at the break. And what this is it's made of keratin, the same stuff your hair or your fingernails are made out of, and it hangs from the roof of their mouth, and they can take a big gulp of water and filter all their food out through this baleen. So those are the baleen whales, or the mysticeti. We also have the odontoceti, or the toothed whales. And so those can range from anything like small, spade-shaped, porpoise-like teeth, like you can see here, to big, large teeth like killer whales or sperm whales, or even the narwhal tusk that's an erupted tooth. So those would fall into those odontocetes, the toothed whales. Now, the divergence between these two groups happened over 35 million years ago. So in evolutionary timescale, it's not that long, but it is quite a long time ago. And when we look at the mysticeti, we can break it down even more into the right whales and the other baleen whales, like gray whales, humpback whales, blue whales. Those are those mysticetes and those baleen whales. Now, the odontocetes, the toothed whales, they are a little bit more diverse. Those are including things like the sperm whales, the river dolphins, the different types of beaked whales, the monodonts, which are the belugas and your narwhals. We have porpoises and, finally, dolphins. And so the odontocetes, those toothed whales, as you can see, represent a much more diverse array of species than those baleen whales. And Tess, shortly after me, will present a little bit more on the specific species of those whales that we see in BC. Now, first, we should just talk a little bit about some general cetacean anatomy and some of the terminology we're going to be using throughout the night. Perfect. So we have, you can see just a typical picture of a Pacific white-sided dolphin here. The dolphins and a lot of the small dolphins and porpoises have a rostrum, that beak on the front of their face. And so this can be a rostrum, a beak, a snout, several of these words, all for that beak right on the front. There's also a blowhole. All these baleen whales, the baleen whales and the odontocetes, the toothed whales, have to breathe air, and we'll talk about that later, but they do so using a blowhole. We have the dorsal fin on the back, the fluke, which is the tail fin, and the pectoral fins on the sides. Almost all the same terminology for those big baleen whales, except that throat, because when they're baleen, they're filter feeding, their throat has to big and expand, and so there's throat grooves and throat pleats on many of the species where that throat would be able to expand big and take in huge volumes of water. And as we talked about earlier, cetaceans are mammals, so we have to keep in mind that they have to share all the same mammalian characteristics. So they do give birth to live young, they're warm-blooded, they breathe air, they lactate. While they're in utero, they do have some hair erupting that oftentimes fall off. A couple species might have a little bit of remnants. But so it's important to keep in mind that these species have a lot of differences that you don't really think of species in the marine world having. They have a little bit more challenges than a lot of the other marine species. Now, not only are there natural challenges that we'll talk about later, but we're adding to these threats with a lot of anthropogenic challenges. So whether it's competition for prey through interactions with fisheries, whether there's different contaminants that we're putting into the water, interactions with other vessels or underwater noise. There's a lot of anthropogenic threats that Chad will touch on a little bit earlier that cetaceans face in the wild. But just life in aquatic world is a challenge in itself. There's several different things and complications that these creatures have had to evolve to be able to cooperate. Let's try again. They've had to evolve to be able to maintain and live in this environment. So just breathing. They are obligate breathers, they have to breathe air, so every time they need to breathe, they need to come to the surface and make that conscious decision to breathe. So one can think that, fish might have an advantage on this, but it's really oxygen in the air is a much higher concentration, so they're getting a high-octane fuel, if you think about it, by breathing air and diving down, but they are limited in their downtime. So this is kind of a trade-off that has evolved with the cetaceans, but breathing, they are obligated to come up to the surface to breathe. Getting around in the ocean is a little bit different. There aren't any physical barriers. If you can swim just about anywhere. It might get a little bit cold, it might get a little bit warm, but you can get there. So this is a little bit different than on land where you might have a giant mountain in your way that you can't necessarily cross. So where you think of terrestrial species having fairly small distributions, a lot of marine species like this killer whale have global distribution. So this is a distribution map for killer whales all around the world. So this is something that's the general trend here is that marine species and cetaceans have a much larger range than a lot of their terrestrial counterparts. And one of the things that that's a little bit different in the water is that getting around is that they don't have to support their body mass on land. So they're not fighting gravity the same way they are in the water. So this has enabled them to get very, very large, to grow to much larger sizes like the blue whale that's the largest creature that has ever lived on our planet. So just some side effects of being able to grow so very large in the water. They also have to think about staying warm. The ocean's not always a warm place, especially for some animals like some Antarctic killer whales or belugas that live up in the high Arctic. The oceans can be pretty cold, even if you're diving down to deep, deep depths. But how they kind of counteract this is there's a very low surface area to volume ratio. So they don't have really long appendages. There's not a very huge surface area on these animals. They're pretty stocky and pretty robust, which means that there's less area for heat loss. So this is one way to combat this. All the cetaceans also have very thick blubber layers, and this blubber is a really dense layer of fat that helps insulate them in the cold waters. They also have the ability to shunt their blood, which that means is they can cut off blood flow and restrict blood flow to their flukes or to their dorsal fin or those pectoral fins, and if they need to stay warm, so restrict that blood flow and keep that blood flow in their core. So these are all kind of adaptations that have evolved to be able to live in this cold environment. Now, there's also challenges in an aquatic world because this is a three-dimensional world. And so if you're trying to eat, you have to chase your prey everywhere, and not just in 2 dimensions, you have to chase them in 3 dimensions. So this can be a little bit more challenging. And then if you're like these humpback whales, you're lunging. So there's those throat pleats we talked about expanding as these whales are engulfing large amounts of food. And the consequence, though, is that they're also engulfing a little bit of extra salt water. Now, they are mammals and they have to drink fresh water. Unfortunately, there's not really much fresh water to drink in the ocean, so they're getting all their freshwater needs from their food sources. So if you're a big baleen whale and feeding on small krill or small fish, all of your diet, all of your water that you're getting to sustain yourself is coming from your diet. So it's coming from tiny, tiny krill or the water in the bodies of tiny, tiny fish. So it's huge requirements, that food requirements, not just for the nutrition in the food, but also for the water they need to maintain their lives. Now, the other consequence of engulfing huge amounts of salt water like this is that it's a little bit hard on your kidneys. So they have extremely specialized kidneys that have many multi-lobed kidneys that are specialized to be able to deal with this extra salt water intake. But as we talked about this 3-dimensional world, not only is it challenging to eat in a 3-dimensional world, mating can be a little bit hard to manage in a 3-dimensional world. It's been akin to, as someone once said, trying to refuel a jet mid-flight. Things can be a little bit challenging to line everything up, get the timing right, get all 3 dimensions lined up, make sure everything's lined up, fits in, get it out, and you're done. It's a little bit challenging. In all the meantime, you have to remember you can't stay down too long because you have to breathe air. So it's just that extra little bit challenging, those challenges to mating, but it is something they have to deal with. So all these cetaceans, as you can see, you can't really tell if they're boys or girls. They have these nice genital slits, so everything tucks right up inside. They keep that nice streamlined body shape. Both males and females have a genital slit. The females will have additional mammary slits on either side where they'll nurse their young. But if you were to see right underneath, you might see that thin little line, that slit where everything will tuck up inside, enable them to mate in that three-dimensional world. So life in aquatic world can be really challenging, and there's lots of ways, and each species really goes about facing these challenges in a different way. And Tess is going to talk to you a little bit about how the different species do accomplish these challenges and face them.
All right, good evening and hello to everyone who's tuning in online as well. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Excellent, okay, perfect, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about cetacean natural history and really taking a special interest in cetaceans in BC. So what can we find around us? Who are these marine mammals, these cetaceans that are sharing our homes, the same waters that we might ourselves spend a lot of time in? But before I get into those local species, I'm going to be talking about cetaceans of the world. So, of course, we know there is a global distribution of cetaceans. There's at least 83 extant or living species, and that is changing. There are some species that are still described by only one individual. That might have been a stranding or perhaps just one sighting. So that number is flexible. Here's a poster of what all those species look like together. It's pretty incredible when you look at this image, the diversity not only in size, but different types of bodies and what these types of adaptations can do in their marine world. Like Carla mentioned, cetacea, there's basically two different groups they're divided into. We're talking about the mysticetes, the baleen whales, and it is the baleen whales who are most plentiful within mysticetes. There's also odontocetes, and those are the toothed whales. And out of the odontocetes, Delphinidae is the most diverse family, and it contains 36 species. So I mentioned they are incredibly diverse. We're talking from the very small vaquita to the largest animal that has ever existed on Earth, the blue whale. And they've got global distribution, so they're found from very, very cold waters. We can find them distributed from temperate to polar latitudes. And in fact, some species can be found pretty much everywhere. For example, killer whales can be found in all of the world's oceans. So zooming into our home province, BC is special. We're home to 28% of the world's cetacean species. In fact, we have 23 species or populations, which in some communities there's a debate if they should be their own species or not, but 23 species in BC here in our local waters. And what's important to note about that is that 12 of those species are listed as at risk under the Species at Risk Act. So when we're thinking about these threats that Carla mentioned and that Chad will touch on, we need to remember that these animals do share our home, and there are actions that we can take certainly to protect them. What is the distribution of these animals? What does it look like? And you can take a look at this image here. This map represents the sightings that have been collected by the BC Cetacean Sightings Network, which is the program that I currently coordinate. And you can see they're basically all over. Keep in mind that sometimes with these sightings, they might occur more frequently around coastal communities because there's more people there. But of course, there are many oceanic species that we can find in the province as well, and I will talk a little bit about them as we go along. Zooming in even closer, we're going to take a look at the Salish Sea. There's a lot of people that live around here. I'm sure many of us live somewhere on this map here. So this gives you an idea of many of the species that can be found very, very close to where we are located. So there's 23 species. Here's a list of them. I've grouped them into kind of more commonly cited species, less frequently cited, and of course there are some uncommon or incidental species that we can find here in British Columbia as well. So starting with the mysticetes. we can talk about the minke whale. The minke whale is a really fascinating whale, but there are really a lot of questions that still remain to be answered about this species. We do know that they're highly vocal. In fact, I've heard someone refer to the vocalizations that minkies can make as almost Star Wars-like. It's really, really amazing. And there's a recent discovery, I think it occurred either late last year or early this year, where for years researchers in the Antarctic, minkies also occur in the Antarctic, were looking for an animal called a bioduck. That's what they were naming, like quack, quack, like that kind of duck, because they'd been hearing this type of vocalization for years. And what they actually discovered is that it was being produced by the species of Antarctic minke whale. So huge variation in the vocalizations that they can create. They'll gulp or skim feed on krill or schooling fish, but sometimes they'll actually erupt out of the water with their mouths open. They don't do a lot of aerial behavior, but like you can see in this image, it is possible. They can be very elusive. They tend to swim quite quickly. If you look at their body, they're very streamlined. They only stay at the surface for a short period of time, and they also move in fairly unpredictable patterns. So not only does that make them difficult to observe, it makes them difficult to research, hence why there are so many questions that still remain with them. Another sign that you can maybe keep your eyes out for minke whales is if you see seabirds. And any idea why they might occur in conjunction? Yep. Yeah, definitely. So they're going to share some of the same prey species. So that's why you often do see them together. Now I have included some videos in my presentation just to give you an idea of what these animals look like in the water. And in this video, you can really see the streamlined shape of the minke whale as it moves through the water. And again, just at the surface, dip back down, and that's typically all you see if you do spot a minke. Moving on, a little bit larger baleen whale, gray whale. Gray whales, I like to say they're more than meets the eye. Some people, when you mention gray whale, they're like, oh yeah, great, it's a gray whale. But they're actually really, really fascinating. They are more than meets the eye, you can see in this picture here, because they do happen to be kind of covered in barnacles and whale lice. So they really are almost like floating communities. But they do some pretty neat things as well. There are about 25,000 of them in the North Pacific, but those whales can undergo incredible migrations. In fact, they'll undergo the longest mammalian migration in the world, traveling from Mexico to the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas each year. So that's almost a 20,000 kilometer round trip. And they'll travel down to those warmer waters to mate. And also to give birth in lagoons in Mexico. And while they travel, or the reason that they come back north is to feed. We don't know a lot about their lifespan. We think it's around 80 years. And I was talking about that migration. They do have to be very careful of killer whales. In fact, Dr. Lance Barrett-Lennard here knows a lot about this area called False Pass in Alaska, which is an area where many migratory gray whales travel through. And there's a specific group of killer whales who will go to that area during this migration. And each year, there's about 150 gray whales that can be taken by killer whales in that area. So certainly, they do need to keep watch out for those predators. Gray whales have a very interesting feeding mechanism, and they'll actually filter feed small invertebrates that can be found in the sediment, usually quite close to shore. In fact, one other really neat thing about gray whales is that they'll almost come in just within about 10 meters or so of the shore. And very interestingly, they do show some laterality. So they'll prefer one side or the other that they kind of scoop when they use their mouth digging into the sand. And they'll have barnacles rubbed away from that air, and their baleen will actually be shorter. They do tend to show preference for the right side, which I find quite interesting as well. And of course, a gray whale video here. You can see that really crusty, kind of mottled skin. And if you take a look down the dorsal surface there, you can see those knuckle-like protrusions. That's a characteristic that we can use to identify gray whales. Of course, along with the absence of a dorsal fin. Even larger than the gray whale, we have humpback whales. And humpback whales were quite newsworthy this year as they continue to recover from historic whaling. So I'm sure many of you have heard that story by now. But their population is recovering. We think there's about 2,100 or so in BC, and that number is increasing at a rate of about 4% a year. In the North Pacific in total, their estimate is currently about 18,000 whales. So like gray whales, humpback whales will undertake a pretty impressive migration between Hawaii and Mexico, or BC and Alaska, between BC and Alaskan waters. And they display some pretty amazing behavior when they are at those breeding grounds. Males will group together in groups called leks. These groups can be extremely aggressive, and the males will battle over females that they might come across. Sometimes this can lead to bloodshed. But their vocal behaviors in these areas are fascinating as well. We don't know why or even how males vocalize, but they produce these incredible vocalizations that we can refer to as songs. And these vocalizations can travel huge distances across the water. What they mean still has yet to be discovered, but really, really neat vocalizations that they can create. Feeding mechanisms are also something that we can, I'm sure we could have a whole course on feeding mechanisms for humpback whales. We're still learning more about the different ways that they've learned how to feed on the krill or the small fish that they do eat. They'll bubble net, which is a group tactic where several whales will swim in a spiral pattern. So they'll emit air from their blowhole, travel in a spiral pattern, and what that creates is this false net, which is very scary if you're a fish. So what you're going to do if you're a fish is group together in a very tight ball, but of course then come the humpbacks right up through the middle of that bubble net, and they've got their mouths full certainly after that. What we do know about bubble netting as well is that different humpbacks, individual humpbacks, will play certain roles within that group. So socially, very interesting, very complex behavior that we are observing there. If you look at the underside of the fluke, which is what you're seeing in the bottom image there, that can act as a fingerprint. And that's really important because we can use that for individual identification for humpback whales. In BC, we can even classify humpback whales into 3 groups based on the percentage of white that you see on the underside of this tail. So from 0 to 20%, you're going to have BCX. So sometimes that tail might be completely black on the other side or dark gray. From about 20 to 60, you're going to see BCY classification. So an individual humpback will be, let's say, BCY 1023 or something like that. And above 60%, you're going to see BCZ. And that's going to be the 3rd category of humpback whales. Humpback whales are also known for some pretty impressive behavior like this. So often very popular with whale watchers, they can be extremely acrobatic. What purpose that behavior serves is certainly up for debate. We think it could be something that occurs for a number of reasons, but in any case, it's very, very impressive. Larger baleen whales that we have in BC, we can talk about the fin whale and the sei whale at the same time. Fin whales are actually the 2nd largest whale or animal on Earth, growing to a length of about 24 meters. What's really interesting about them is that, well, we don't really know a lot about them. We know that they were persecuted, of course, during when whaling was going on. But other than that, the ones that remain, we're not really sure about their movements, where they really tend to spend time. But we have seen them in BC, and certainly when I was out in the field earlier this summer, we saw quite a few in offshore environments. They do eat a lot. They can eat up to 1 ton of prey a day in the summer. And they have a really unique bicolored jaw that we can use as an identification technique, which is very important when we're thinking of comparing them to the sei whale, which are a little bit smaller. And although it's not completely obvious in these 2 images, these 2 species can look very much alike. Sei whales are not as seen as frequently as fin whales are. They were heavily persecuted during whaling, not at first, but when there were no more blue whales or fin whales to go after in the 1960s, sei whales became very popular. So they're still recovering from that, and we're not really sure why they're not seen as frequently. But certainly I know a lot of biologists who would absolutely love to have their first sei whale sighting, and they spend lots of time out on the water. The 4 images here I wanted to talk about briefly. On the left, you're looking at fin whales. And what's really interesting with the top image there on the left is that you're not seeing the blowhole and the dorsal fin out of the water at the same time. For fin whales, when you see them surface, you're going to see the blowhole, then you're going to see the back, then you're going to see the dorsal fin. If you look at the top right picture, you're going to see a sei whale there, and what you're looking at is, of course, that blowhole out of the water and that dorsal fin. So that's a diagnostic kind of identification technique you can use. I did mention the bicolored jaw for the fin whale. So on the bottom left, you're seeing that it's white on the right side. On the left side, it's actually very, very dark. So blue whales. Of course, I'm sure you've heard of blue whales. You probably know some pretty amazing facts about the size of their hearts or, anything to do with size is fascinating with blue whales. And they truly are a species of extreme. They're bigger than any animal that's ever existed on Earth, bigger than any dinosaurs ever were. They're also the fastest cetacean, and they're also the fastest large cetacean, and they're also the loudest animal on Earth. The vocalizations that they can create are louder than a jumbo jet, but much of those vocalizations occur below the hearing range in which humans are able to perceive, but certainly those vocalizations can actually travel for hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers, which is very important if you're a nomadic species who is really few and far between, spread out over a wide offshore environment. I wanted to play this video here. It's from one of the observers who participates in the BC Cetacean Sightings Network. But you really get a scope of how large these animals are through this video. So at first, it's kind of like you don't really know what you're looking at, but in a second, you'll see a spout. And that spout is actually several stories tall. As we zoom in, you really get an idea of how large these animals are. Very, very impressive. So up to about 33 meters in length. Another baleen whale we have in our waters is the North Pacific right whale, another very newsworthy species, typically because sightings don't happen very often. In fact, in 2013, there were 2 sightings, which marked the first time the species was seen in over 60 years. Now that's because this whale was the right whale to catch during whaling, and that's in fact where their name does come from. They're very slow-moving, rich in oil, which means the bang for your buck that these whalers were getting was just through the roof. So unfortunately, we're seeing this population very much struggle to overcome the threat that they did have during whaling, and it's estimated that there's only about 100 in the North Pacific currently, although that number is highly debated and it could be quite variable. What's really neat about them, though, what's different, is that they have these callosities that you can see kind of on the top of the head. And that's keratinized tissue, so it's quite rough, but that's also colonized by many, many whale lice. So they kind of live in these little islands on the head of the North Pacific right whale. And the largest callosity that's right near the tip of the head, that's called a bonnet. So I'm not sure why it has a special name like that, but it's certainly neat that these animals do possess those callosities. Like the gray whale, North Pacific right whales don't have dorsal fins, and they do display a really interesting behavior called skim feeding, where they kind of open their mouth and swim right at the surface of the water, just kind of collecting prey as they go. And you'll see that in their closest relatives as well, who live up in the Arctic. Anyone know what that whale might be? Yep, bowhead. Yep, bowhead whales, absolutely. They're very closely related to white whales. While they do kind of sound slow and maybe a bit more docile when I am describing them skim feeding, they can be acrobatic as well, and they'll display behaviors like breaching, lob-tailing, pectoral slapping. And again, I did mention those 2 sightings in 2013, which were extremely exciting for the species. So moving on from mysticetes to odontocetes, we'll start small and then get a little bit bigger. So harbor porpoise are the smallest cetacean that we have in British Columbia, and they can actually be overlooked quite often. They tend to be quite inconspicuous. Some people describe them as shy, often avoiding boats and people. But interestingly, they are common year-round here, and we do certainly get quite a few reports of them at the BC Cetacean Sightings Network. Typically, they are traveling alone, although in the spring especially, they may form social or feeding groups of up to about 20. One of the differences between porpoises and dolphins, like Carla briefly mentioned, is the tooth shape. So dolphins are going to have cone-shaped teeth, while porpoises are going to have spade-shaped teeth. So these harbor porpoises are going to have spade-shaped teeth. And interestingly, although they are common, they are the most commonly entangled small cetacean in BC. So that is one of the great threats facing this species. In the water, they can be typically quite calm. I've heard someone describe them as almost like they're spinning on an axis. So you see that triangular porpoise fin pop out of the water, dip back down, and that's often the extent of what a harbor porpoise sighting comprises. Dall's porpoises, well, still a porpoise, they tend to exhibit quite opposite behavior to harbor porpoises. They travel in slightly larger groups. They are extremely fast. In fact, they're the fastest small cetacean along our coast, traveling at speeds of about 55 kilometers an hour. And you can see that kind of V-shaped splash coming off the body in this image. That's called a rooster tail, and that's a result of that very fast speed they can reach right at the surface of the water. Oftentimes, Dall's porpoise will actually interact with boats. So sometimes you'll see them bow riding, that kind of thing. And I have to put in a plug for the Be Whale-Wise guidelines, which Chad is going to cover, because we need to be talking about best practices when it comes to marine mammals, but sometimes Dalls will come and interact with vessels. They are quite common as well. So in the North Pacific, very large area, we do have quite a number of them present. In the video here, you'll see the Dall's porpoise moving very slowly, and that's because I want you to check out that dorsal fin. Then you're going to see a second bump there. It's called a caudal peduncle. It's a large chunk of muscle, and that's what propels them to very fast speeds like this here. And there you observed that rooster tail splash as well. Pacific white-sided dolphins, very, very charismatic species that we have along our coast. And they're going to be typically traveling in very large numbers. The biggest group that's ever been observed for this species was around 6,000 animals that occurred offshore. But the average group is around 60 or so. They are wide-ranging. We'll see them over to the coast of Japan, from Alaska down to Mexico, and certainly we see them in our local waters as well. Opportunistic feeders, they feed on countless numbers of fish and cephalopods, and they are preyed on by killer whales. In fact, if you remember back to March of this year, there was a story in the news about Pacific white-sided dolphins near Squamish being hunted by killer whales. Very, very acrobatic as well. Just like you're seeing in this picture, that is quite representative of what you'll see if you do come across this species. They have a very interesting history in the province of British Columbia. About 2,000 years ago, we know that they spent time right along the coast, so in coastal waters, because their teeth were found in First Nations middens. Now, shortly after that time, they disappeared. So for some reason, they decided that offshore was a better habitat, or one that they wanted to spend more time in. And up until about the mid-80s, or mid to late 80s, sightings were very, very few and far between for this species. Starting in the mid-90s or so, those sightings started to increase. And in fact, today, we can see that those green dots you're looking at in the map, they are very coastal. So we now can say this species has once again become coastal. We're not exactly sure why they came back. It might have to do with ocean temperature or prey distribution. And very interestingly, Howe Sound is quite a hot spot for them as well. So that started just a few years ago, this trend where we're seeing Pacific white-sided dolphins in great number in Howe Sound. A video of Pacific white-sided dolphins for you. Like I described, you can see they're very kind of curved dorsal fin, which is different from porpoises, which tend to have much more triangular dorsal fins. Of course, absolutely beautiful, large group that you're seeing traveling here, but they can display very, very acrobatic behavior as well. Rhesus dolphins, they're a less commonly spotted species, probably because they do spend most of their time in oceanic environments. And I'll talk about them in conjunction with northern right whale dolphins as well, which also tend to spend a lot of time in oceanic environments. Both tend to travel in fairly large groups, although the northern right whale dolphin can be observed sometimes in the thousands. And just a couple weeks ago, we received a sighting at the Sightings Network of just absolutely thousands of them in an offshore environment, and they're really kind of bizarre looking. They don't have a dorsal fin. They almost look like leeches kind of jumping out of the water. It's kind of neat. These pictures that you can see kind of best describe what they would look like in that environment. So you can see in the bottom right there what I'm talking about. They're just very, very narrow, very streamlined animals, which does help them travel at quite great speeds. Rhesus dolphins, on the other hand, on the left, covered in scratches of really an unknown origin. We think that it's from other members of the groups that they travel with. When they're born, they're basically completely gray, but elderly animals can be almost entirely white just from these scratches. Both species, still many questions remain about them, but we do know that they occur off of our coast. False killer whale, another animal that's made the news, of course, recently, with one individual at the Marine Mammal Rescue Center right now, Chester. But sightings don't come in very often of these animals. We do know that they're extremely social. They're highly vocal, and they display some really interesting behaviors like mass strandings, which really we don't know why that happens, but it tends to be something that occurs for false killer whales. Lots of records of human interaction with these animals as well. There was a case of one false killer whale, I believe his name or its name was Willie, that traveled around with several vessels in BC for quite some time before ending that behavior. But you can see they have really kind of interestingly shaped pectoral flippers, those ones on the side. Those can be used for species identification. Beaked whales, probably the most mysterious type of cetacean that we can find in the world. We know there are quite a number of species, but again, when I was talking about some species only being described by one individual from a stranding or maybe from one sighting, that's pretty descriptive of beaked whales. They can be very, very difficult to spot, but when people do come across them, it's very exciting. What's unique about them is basically all their teeth are vestigial, but they have usually 2 teeth on the lower jaw in most adult males and some females in some species that erupt upwards, almost like tusks. They are social. They do travel in groups, heavily scarred like the Rhesus dolphins, but again, oceanic, so sightings are very few and far between of these species. And just on the right-hand side, you can see the 4 species that can be found in British Columbia. And these are not to scale, but those are Baird's, Cuvier's, Hubs, and Senegar's beaked whales. Sperm whales, really, really amazing animals. They're not at risk in British Columbia, so we do know they're out there in numbers, but they're also not seen very frequently because they are oceanic. Another species of extremes, like blue whales, they tend to dive for a very long time. They eat really big prey. They do prey on giant squid. With some really interesting teeth on their lower jaw. Each one of those teeth can weigh up to about 1 kilogram or so. So we're talking about really big teeth. They have a couple interesting things in their bodies. I guess I can describe them as that. They have spermaceti, which is a oil-like wax that's found in their head, and that's where they get their name from. And they also have ambergris, which is basically a digestive byproduct. It's found in their intestines. They can excrete it. It sometimes floats and washes up on beaches, but it's actually prized by perfumers, sometimes used in very fancy perfume, which is kind of gross to think about. Depredation is also an issue, and what depredation is when catch is taken by a cetacean from a line, and certainly that can be dangerous for both the boaters and the animals involved, and that is certainly a major issue. I'm not sure if Chad's included it, but depredation is certainly something that we are watching on the radar. I will conclude by talking just very briefly about killer whales. Certainly I'll leave most of that up to Dr. Lance Barrett-Lennard here. But I'm sure many of you are familiar with killer whales. They are certainly the most iconic species of cetacean we can find off of our coast. And in British Columbia, we're actually very lucky because we have 3 distinct types of killer whales off of our shores, and we refer to those as ecotypes. So we have residents, bigs, also known as transients, and offshores. Now, there's 2 populations of residents, southern and northern. Those populations are distinct. They do not mix. And they're quite different, particularly in number. Northern residents tend to be doing quite well. They're at about 260 right now. Their numbers seem to be increasing. Very different story for the southern resident killer whales, who are at about 80 or so, and it is concerning for them. Bigs or transient whales, we think are numbered about 300, but their behavior tends to be quite variable, and they have a massive range, so it's difficult to say. And for the offshore killer whales, again, found in an oceanic environment. What does that mean? They're very mysterious. So there's about 211 catalogs so far. By no means does that comprise the entire population. We definitely are still describing individuals from that population for the first time. And just for fun, we'll play a killer whale video. Very iconic species along our coast. Here you can see them almost displaying a resting line in that first shot, but they tend to exhibit a whole host of behaviors, rolling around in the water, sometimes spy hopping, which is where the head comes out of the water there, maybe to check out what's above the surface of the water in their environment, but always a thrill to see killer whales in British Columbian waters. Residents, fish eaters, particularly out of the 5 species of Pacific salmon we have in our waters, they do specialize on Chinook. Their movement patterns, therefore, tend to be quite predictable, at least in the summer, because they're following where the fish go. They do travel in matrilines, so male and female offspring will stay with their mother for their entire lives. And for this reason, large groups can be observed. They are highly vocal as well. And does anyone want to have an idea why that might be? Yeah.
Well, that depends on the ecotypes. The big whales tend to be silent, and
That's right, and I'm just going to cut you off there because you're giving away some of my secrets here that I was just about to get into. But talking about resident killer whales, they do tend to be highly vocal, which is contrasting to the big whales, like you said, because the salmon can't hear very well under the water. So certainly resident salmon eaters can make as much noise as they would like, and that is contrasting to big whales, who tend to be mostly silent because they're going to be eating marine mammals, other cetaceans, pinnipeds, who have very good underwater hearing. They're going to have a large range, these big killer whales, from Alaska all the way down to California. They travel in loose groups, not quite as tight as those matrilines are for the residents. We also think their population is increasing in BC by about 2 to 3% a year. And the Pacific Wild Watching Association did release a media release a couple weeks ago that said that they've had an incredible number of transient or big killer whale sightings this year. That last group, offshore killer whales, again, largely mysterious. We do know 2 main things about them. They travel in very large groups, and we also know that they eat some pretty interesting prey. They're going to be focusing on deep-sea fish like halibut as well as sharks. And for that reason, their teeth are very worn down, sometimes almost to the pulp from that sandpaper-like texture of shark skin. So with that, I will conclude talking about those BC species and their natural history. I'm not sure if we're going to take a break now. Yeah, I think we're probably going to have a break, 15 minutes or so, and Dr. Lance Barrett-Lennard will pick up from there.
So we have some water and we have some cookies, so you can have a little bit of
Okay, I've been giving the word to get started again. So I'm going to launch into about 30 minutes or so on on what we've learned, I guess, over the last 40 years of killer whale research, particularly here in British Columbia, particularly but not exclusively. Now the next thing I need to learn is how to use this. Here we go. So it's been really interesting. I've been involved in this game for about 25. Oh gosh, it's over 25 years now. My wife and I, Kathy Heisey, and I started as lighthouse keepers on the coast. We did biology degrees at the University of Guelph in Ontario. Moved to British Columbia. Just had this romantic notion of becoming lighthouse keepers. Did that for a few years. We had killer whales swimming by us all the time, and we realized we could recognize them. And shortly after that, we recognized individuals, that is. And then shortly afterwards, we heard about this guy named Mike Bigg, who I mentioned before, and who was a scientist at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans at the time. And we went and met Mike, and that's how we got hooked. But I think with any this is probably true of any sort of focused study of a wildlife species, or perhaps this is true for botanists and others too. I don't know, but when you start off with a new system, as we tend to call them now, or a new species, as we used to call them, you spend a lot of your early days and your first graduate students and so on, if you're at a university, sort of apologizing for the lack of knowledge that you have about your species. And people say, why don't you work on something more tractable, like the fruit fly system, for example? And you try to explain to them why you're not a whale hugger, because that's not okay in university, but you've got a genuine sort of scientific interest in your species. And then at some point along your career path, if you continue with it, you suddenly wake up and realize, well, we've actually got a fair bit here. We have to stop apologizing. You do it for a few years beyond the time when it's really necessary. And I think that's the way, and I certainly came along late in the game, really, but that's the way with killer whale research here in British Columbia. 1960, the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans installed a machine gun at Seymour Narrows between Vancouver Island and Quadra Island to cull killer whales. This was based on complaints from sports fishermen at Painter's Lodge in Campbell River who observed, and actually they were correct, the killer whales were competing with them for spring salmon. Now, the Canadian Department of Fisheries put this gun in place, and there's an abundant correspondence in the files at the Pacific Biological Station about the right caliber of machine gun to use, and the size of bullets, and the stopping power, and all this kind of stuff. And I think they talked about it so much they never got around to doing it. So luckily, the gun was actually never fired. In fact, I'm not actually sure if it was really put on its big cement base, but the base was poured for it. Frank Mercado and Boots Calandrino attempted to lasso and capture a killer whale in Washington in the early 1960s. That was unsuccessful, but it got some press. 1964, the Vancouver Aquarium, our former director, Dr. Murray Newman, decided that we should have an anatomically perfectly correct killer whale sculpture, and the way to do that was to get a specimen. And this was the days, of course, when biologists went out and shot first and asked questions later. That was just the way it was done. And so a sculpture was commissioned, and the first part of this was harpooning a killer whale. Well, the killer whale was called Moby Doll. It was hit with a harpoon that passed through the skin and the very, very thin underlying tissue in the back of its head, and it survived. So it was towed across Strait of Georgia and resided in a net pen in Vancouver Harbor for 3 months before it died. And it was a sad story, particularly looked at with our 2014 eyes. But it really did demonstrate in a way that these animals are not the ferocious sort of shark-like critters that they were presumed to be at that point. And in fact, it's quite funny to look at some of the photographs of those days when poor little gentle Moby Doll living in this net pen, and people would stand back with 20-foot poles with a fish on the end because they were sure that it turned out to be he, was going to jump out and eat their arm. So with the experience of Moby Doll, it was realized that these animals really weren't anything like what had been expected before. So in 1965, the Seattle Aquarium acquired a killer whale from a fisherman. That was called, the whale's name was Namu, from the little cannery village of Namu up on the Central Coast. And then larger scale captures for the display industry, if you like, began a couple of years later. In 1971, because there was this generalized interest in catching killer whales and putting them on display, the Canadian Fisheries and Oceans Department decided that somebody should find out how many there are and they should develop a harvest plan. So Dr. Michael Bigg, a sort of new, wet behind the ears young research scientist at the Pacific Biological Station got the job. Mike conducted the world's first animal census. These next few pages are kind of text heavy, so the little handout that you need a microscope to read is just a printout of these, I think, first four slides in this section. Anyway, Mike conducted the world's first animal census of a species in the wild like this. In 1971, repeated it in 72 and 73. The concept was simple. He got everybody that he possibly could through newspaper advertisements and radio ads and TV and so on to count all the whales and keep an accurate description of exactly where they were on one day in the summer, July 26th. That's the best day of the year according to all the weather information he could dig up. And to send that information in, and he spent months and months looking at it and trying to see if somebody had a sighting at 10:05 and somebody later on had one at 10:20, and was it the same group or a different group? He came up with a number, somewhere on the order of 200 to 350 killer whales on the BC, Washington coast. Well, that number was widely disputed. It was thought to be, fishermen and members of the general public that were boaters thought that was probably an order of magnitude too small. It was, a tenth of the real number. Of course, later on, it was determined that number was remarkably accurate, really. 1976 was the last capture in Washington. And the DFO, as it's now known, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, decided that not to authorize any additional captures. Mike also, about that time, recognized that there were two distinct types of killer whales. These are the Biggs killer whales and the resident killer whales that Tess referred to. These two ecotypically distinct groups. This was long before the offshores were discovered. And Mike was thanked by the department and told to work on harbor seals for the rest of his career. Thankfully, he didn't. He had a secret sort of little project going on, which took about 98% of his time, and that was to continue this illicit study of killer whales. And I had the good fortune to work for him as a technician for a little while in 1989 and early 1990, 6 months before he died, actually. And part of my job was to run cover for him. If the director of the biological station came down, we had to hide all the killer whale pictures. And he actually had these old, the old maps in your geography classroom, and you'd pull them down, and the world, the British Commonwealth in red, He had a bunch of those. And he had all these pictures of killer whales on the blackboards, but he could pull the maps down, and there were pictures of seals on the maps. So he was always worried the director had his office bugged, but I don't think there was any evidence of that. So anyway, as I say, sadly Mike died in 1990, but he really got all this started. In the 80s, we saw this existence of these two distinct groups, residents and transients, or Biggs killer whales, was confirmed, and the stability of resident killer whale pods in particular was recognized, and Tess referred to matrilines. This was established at that time. And also the two communities, as Mike referred to them, as we now usually call them populations, although I don't think community is a bad word for this, were discovered. And these are the so-called southern residents and northern residents that occupy the bottom third and the top two-thirds of the province, roughly. 1984, Dr. John Ford, who was here at the Vancouver Aquarium at the time, just started, finished his PhD in 84 and took up a postdoc here. He completed his and published his groundbreaking study of the dialects of resident killer whales. This was really heady stuff. It turned out every killer whale pod had a distinct dialect, every resident killer whale pod, and John could identify them over the phone. People could call up, and there were no cell phones then, so I guess they'd have to have a long extension cord from their cottage and put it down near the water, and he could tell them which pod was swimming by. And John realized that these dialects fell into, for the northern resident population, for example, fell into 3 distinct groups. You know, although each pod had a dialect, some dialects were more similar than others. There were three language groups, if you like, and he called each of these 3 groups clans, and that's turned out to be a good word, I think, to describe them. I'll explain why later on, perhaps. 1984, my friend and colleague Craig Matkin started a parallel study of Prince William Sound killer whales up in Alaska. Craig came down here and introduced himself to Mike and slept on his living room floor for a couple of months. And Mike finally sent him back to Alaska, and he started a very important and productive research program up there. 1989, National Marine Fisheries Service and SeaWorld biologists challenged Mike on the reliability of this technique of photo identification that he'd come up with. They challenged his longevity estimates, and the existence of residents and Biggs killer whales. It was quite interesting, but anyway, the evidence was robust, and the existence of these were confirmed. And as I say, he died in 1990 just after publishing this very seminal paper on resident killer whale social organization. The last 25 years, so Craig and colleagues went on to confirm the population structure of killer whales in Prince William Sound in the wake of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I discovered that distinctly different echolocation behavior by residents and transients. That refers back to the question earlier on. These are very, very different animals. They're really behaving very much like different species. Later on, the genetic work that John supervised and I did confirmed that, based on DNA analysis, confirmed that the independence of resident and transient killer whales, they don't intermate. John Ford, later on in 2005, identified a link between Chinook salmon abundance and resident killer whale mortality. Basically, when Chinook salmon numbers go down catastrophically, after a really bad Chinook year, resident killer whale mortality goes up strikingly. It's a very, very strong correlation. Around the same time, Bob Pittman and his colleagues identified 4, now 5, possibly 6 distinct killer whale populations in the Antarctic. So we know this species, if it's a super species or really a species complex of killer whales, has this propensity to diversify. And in 2012, my friend and colleague Dr. John Durbin, developed photogrammetry methods to assess killer whale body condition in the field. I'll talk about that. Actually, 2012? No, that was a bit earlier than that. So just very briefly, this can be a review because Tess has pretty much covered this. Resident killer whales. There are three well-known populations along the coast. She mentioned 2 in British Columbia, as she said, the southern residents in yellow here, the northern residents in red. There's a group called the Gulf of Alaska residents above that, and that group was the focus of Craig Matkin's studies in Prince William Sound. As we've mentioned, these guys have a strong preference for Chinook salmon. They'll also eat chum salmon. They'll also eat some other halibut, a few other fish species. Interestingly, they seem to eat virtually no pink salmon, even in years when pinks are abundant, or sockeye. Pinks I can sort of understand. They're fairly low calorie and small, but sockeye are a bit hard to understand why they don't take them more often. But anyway, Chinook are the biggest, and that's what killer whales want. And chum are the second biggest. Biggs killer whales, I keep slipping and calling these transients. That's the former term. These ones, as Tess mentioned, feed on marine mammals exclusively. We have a fair bit of knowledge about 3 populations along the coast, one extending from California all the way up through BC into southeast Alaska, shown in red. The Gulf of Alaska transients in light blue. And then orange, you can see this little small area where the AT1 transients live. That's just Prince William Sound and Resurrection Bay up near Whittier, Homer, Cordova, Seward, those little towns in Alaska. This group is very small. In fact, it's down to just 5 individuals now. It's dying out, and it's a sad thing. And a lot of them, a large percentage of this group went missing at the time of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. They don't intermate with the larger population that's around them of big killer whales, the ones in light blue. They're genetically distinct and culturally distinct, very different vocalizations. So it's been sad in my lifetime to watch these guys go down. I spent 3 years up in Prince William Sound in the late 80s, early 90s. As I mentioned, this picture was taken by Peter Lesiak. As we mentioned, they feed on, big killer whales feed on marine mammals, and that takes a lot of skill. You know, handling a large adult stellar sea lion like this there's definitely a risk of injury. The killer whales are much bigger, but they're soft-skinned, and they have big teeth, but they don't have any body armor. Their mouths and their jaws aren't strong enough or big enough to grab an animal this size. So it takes a lot of both chutzpah and skill to do it. And that skill is passed on by learning. Offshores, we now know, feed on, as Tess mentioned, a variety of fish, but sharks are very important in their diet, particularly sleeper sharks, which is interesting. They have a very broad distribution, cover a lot of the coast. Here's the sleeper shark, in case you've never seen one. And if you have seen one, you're one of about 3 people in Canada, I think, so congratulate yourself. So here's when we overlap the distribution of these sort of known populations of killer whales on top of each other, you get a really complicated picture. This is kind of what it looks like. Bigs in red, residents in black, and offshores in blue. And then in more recent work by Craig and I working together, and several others now out along the tip of the Alaska Peninsula and the southern Bering Sea, we know that there are at least 2 more resident populations and 2 more transient populations out there. And as we go across the top of the Pacific to Russia, there's at least 1 population of each. So again, this super species has this real propensity to divide into these almost xenophobic populations, if you like. Field research, a couple of the basic tools, I mentioned photo identification, we do that all the time. We've got a question over there. Yes, can you say? Green circles. Oh, that's a good, yeah, you got me there. That's down in Southern California and Baja, and there's a couple of populations there that we don't really know very much. In fact, we don't actually know if there should be 1 green circle or 2 green circles down there. There's a group called the LA Killers, and they show up every few years and raise havoc, but we don't know much about them.
One of your colleagues who studies in the Sea of Cortez suggested that their offshore circus swim around the Sea of Cortez and mostly on the Pacific side.
Yeah, I haven't heard of offshores going into the Sea of Cortez myself, but yes, they have been seen down to Southern California, to the border with Mexico anyway, I know that. Field research again, a couple of the basic tools we use in addition to a camera for photo identification is a hydrophone. That's what this guy with a beard that looks like Che Guevara is holding in his hand. It might be me. And there's in the bottom picture is a biopsy dart that's about the size of a pencil, and that's what we use to collect little skin samples from the whales. We fire this with an air rifle. It bounces off the back of the whales. It collects a piece of skin the size of a cigarette filter, and that's enough to get enough DNA for a lifetime of work, really. So we have over 400, getting close to 500 animals, I guess, biopsy sampled in British Columbia and Alaska now. I won't belabor this slide, but this is just a map of gene space, if you like, based on the so-called mitochondrial DNA. This is the DNA in your cells that is only inherited from your mother. And what this is intended to show, really, is that there's a cluster. All of the different populations of big killer whales are genetically quite similar. There's a break shown in the little line connecting them to other whales, and that's because this would be a barbell-shaped figure with these clusters quite a lot further apart than appears in this the slide, and the resident killer whales all cluster together, so they have closer maternal relatives with each other than they do to the transients. And offshores and some miscellaneous killer whales sampled from the Atlantic all cluster with the residents. Okay, behavioral and ecological differences between residents and transient killer whales are almost, or big killer whales, are almost certainly not genetically maintained and transmitted. There just isn't enough genetic variation for that to be realistically possible. We're certain that these differences are learned and are passed on culturally, if you like, between both horizontally between members of a common generation and vertically from one generation to the next within killer whale groups. So these differences would include their repertoires, their dietary preferences, foraging behavior, social organization, even their mating preferences are learned, which is bizarre, dispersal patterns and so on, their use of echolocation. So why would these residents and transients have such, residents and bigs have such, divergent, if you like, cultures? Well, we think that's because this cultural displacement, if you like, this separation of feeding habits and dietary preferences reduces competition. And the residents and bigs killer whales coexist. They actually swim through the same waters. They share the same space. They don't socialize. They avoid each other. But, you can see them sometimes on the same day, relatively close together, just avoiding each other. And they can do that because they're actually not competing for resources. They're not competing for access to females either. They don't intermate. So there's no mate competition and there's no food competition. If one of them breaks the rules, if a transient starts eating Chinook, then it's trouble, and vice versa, we think. This is speculation, but it's the only reasonable speculation that anyone in my field has come up with to explain how these differences persist. What would happen if they lost their culture? Well, we think the converse of really all the reasons that the reasons that they have culture. It would compromise their ability to find food, loss of hunting skills, the reduced ability to perceive and recognize risk and reduce it. A lot of that knowledge, if you like, or the information about what's scary and what's dangerous is passed on between individuals. They don't have to learn everything by trial and error, unlike most. I have a 15-year-old son. He learns everything by trial and error, but I try a little cultural stuff, but it doesn't always work. And reduce social cohesion. And of course, I think the big one is increased competition and conflict with neighboring groups. Am I getting taller, or is this mic sort of slowly going down? I think that it's going down. So which individuals in the group are responsible for passing culture on? Well, we think that it's females, and we think it's older females. And part of the reason for thinking that is that females live much longer than males, and there's presumably an evolutionary reason for that. They must be of some value to the group. They go through menopause, so there are some value to the group after they've some important value to the group after even when they're no longer reproducing. And they must benefit the survival of the group for those genes, those longevity genes to be passed on, if you like. So we think that they're the ones that are responsible primarily for passing on culture, not exclusively, but there's multiple reasons for thinking this that I could go into later on. So I'm going to move into a slightly different theme for a couple of minutes, and that is, a discussion of what factors determine the abundance of killer whales. In most wild populations, ultimately, the abundance is determined by some formula that takes into account the availability of food, how much predation pressure there is, disease. I would link in with predation here, and some sort of behavior. Sometimes animals are good at spacing themselves out through territoriality. From the early 1970s, in the case of killer whales, until very recently, we had no idea what determined their numbers. In fact, from the early 1970s, the numbers in BC were increasing, both of bigs and resident killer whales. And then John Ford, as I mentioned in the little history summary, sort of made this fairly revolutionary observation, I think, and that is that, as I mentioned before, that in poor salmon years, so if we have Chinook abundance on the bottom of this graph, you can see a period between, the kind of early-ish 1990s and the early-ish 2000s when Chinook salmon numbers were way down, and there was a corresponding spike in the mortality of both northern and southern resident killer whales. This Chinook abundance was an overall coast-wide index, so all of the rivers, major salmon runs were down during that period. And so it really looked like, perhaps resident killer whales anyway are up against a food ceiling. So they've been increasing for a number of years, and they've hit a ceiling. Why were they increasing? We don't know, but it could be that there's very few of them. It's a very small population. They're very vulnerable. They're easy to shoot. I can attest to that, having biopsied hundreds of them. Every fishing boat, in the first, throughout most of the 1900s, had a rifle on board. It's very likely that a lot of these animals were simply shot because they were competition for salmon. There are other things that may have affected the population size as well. But anyway, as I say, this Chinook abundance affected both populations. This is just this last graph I'll show, I promise, showing this relationship between Chinook salmon abundance index. It has very little effect on birth, but it has a big, that's in the bottom graph, slight effect on birth. But it appears to have a very big effect on mortality. So there were 4 workshops convened starting about 4 years ago between the Canadian, involving the Canadian and U.S. governments to look at this information and decide whether anything should be done in terms of changing the way Chinook salmon fisheries are managed in order to make sure that there was enough food for killer whales. This was something the governments of both countries were responsible for doing, really under their own endangered species legislation. Southern resident killer whales are endangered, and they had to do something. So they convened this workshop. I attended, along with many others, attended all of them. The conclusions, after lots and lots of discussion and debate, were that increases in Chinook salmon abundance would lead to higher survival rates and therefore higher population growth rates of southern resident killer whales. But the effect isn't linear. Consistently positive growth rates can occur by avoiding extremely low Chinook salmon levels. So although the relationship isn't linear, it seems very clear that when salmon numbers are really low, there's an impact on killer whales. But sadly, in a way, the workshop panel concluded that elimination of ocean fisheries for Chinook salmon would impact salmon abundance far less than the variations that we've seen in salmon since the 1970s. In other words, there's high variation in salmon, regardless of fisheries, and they couldn't untangle which runs of Chinook salmon were the most important for the killer whales. If they could have done that, they being we, I should say, I guess being a member of that group, if we could have figured out which is in Fraser River Chinook salmon that are important, is it the Naus and the Skeena, then there could have been recommendations to curtail fisheries. But when it's the whole coast, and this is a lot of hardship for people, fishing communities, to shut the whole fishery down, there were no recommendations at the end of the day. But there was or at least there was no recommendations to fisheries managers, but there was a recommendation that this technique called photogrammetry be further investigated. And what, sorry, it's just too distracting. What photogrammetry is, it means measuring from photographs. And it was realized by the panel that mortality is a rough index, is a coarse index of an impact of food declines. In other words, if you have to wait for something to die because it was hungry, die of starvation, then you're kind of after the fact by the time you draw your conclusions. And a lot of animals die randomly from factor, not randomly necessarily, but from disease or things not to do with food. So there's a lot of noise in those data. And surely it would be better to be able to look at body condition rather than death, to try and figure out which salmon runs were most important. So the one way to look at body condition in killer whales is to use this technique called photogrammetry, to take pictures and to try and infer from those photos, whether the animals are fat or skinny, and if they're skinny, if some of them are skinny, if that's correlated or if it's just a few individuals. So this recommendation was made. There are 2 ways to do it. One is to do horizontal photogrammetry, where you're in your boat taking pictures of killer whales and trying to take measurements from those. Another one is to look at them from above. John Durbin, my colleague who I mentioned before, had developed this technique of horizontal photogrammetry. You can see two dots on the killer whale, on the fin of this killer whale. They're exactly 10 centimeters apart. And John attached two laser pointers. I don't know if I've got one in here, I probably do. Like that. There, to his camera, and he made them, and he set them up with a rig so that they were exactly parallel. And so they projected dots when he took a photo. No matter how far away the killer whale was, the dots were always 10 centimeters apart. And this provided a way to actually measure. It put a yardstick on the killer whales, if you like, and it provided a way to measure them. And so here the little L is that the distance between the two dots. So you've got, from that you can infer the height of the dorsal fin, you can infer the width of the dorsal fin to blowhole length, and so on. So John did a lot of work showing that he could get accurate lengths, blowhole to dorsal fin lengths anyway, and extrapolate those to total lengths using this method. It's quite effective. It was really good for looking at differences between populations. But I'm going to go back to that. Turns out that killer whales are really good at camouflaging when they get into poor condition, when they're starving, because they've got these firm, streamlined bodies, and if they start getting saggy and lumpy from being skinny, they lose their streamlining. So as they lose blubber, as they use up their fat reserves, they switch it out with water. So their blubber tissue, if you cut them open, if their blubber tissue is full of oil, they're in good condition. Sometimes their blubber is full of water, and they're in poor condition. They get a condition when they get really skinny, which, as Tess said, is likely to be, or Carla, when they're dehydrated. Then they begin to show it in their physical appearance. But then they're in a death spiral. There's a small chance of them recovering. So when they starve acutely, they begin to get dehydrated. So we wanted to be able to, so looking at them from the side like this, bottom line is, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell when they're really when they're in somewhat poor condition. So, so John and I discussed, we had worked together a lot in Alaska, and we discussed a couple of years ago using a hexacopter or some sort of remotely operated little toy helicopter to get over the top of whales so we could look at their width. Even though their general form doesn't change much as they lose lipids, their girth does. They get generally a bit thinner. And we thought if we could get vertical photos, we could ascertain that. John had done a bit of this using a manned helicopter in Washington and shown that it was quite a promising technique, but it was way too expensive to use a real helicopter, and way too disturbing for the killer whales. Helicopters are noisy. So this year, summer of this year, he and I and Dr. Holly Fearing set out to give it a try in Johnson Strait. This is the little unit that we used. It's got a camera mounted to the bottom. It was provided for our use by NOAA. It's an expensive little thing, this particular unit, but it worked really well. So we launched it from the top of our little Vancouver Aquarium research boat, launched it by hand, retrieved it by hand. There it is, somewhere over here. So it was quite inconspicuous. We flew it over the whales at a height of 100 feet. And at that height, we got no behavioral reactions that we could see whatsoever. The whales seemed completely unaware of it. And these were the kind of photos that we got. So the water was fairly clear in Johnson Strait this summer, and so these whales are actually all underwater right now, just below the water surface. And we could measure we could recognize individuals. Their saddle patches show up quite nicely, so we could see all those scars and scratches. And we could tell which ones are fat, which ones are thin, and get a good sense of their length to width ratios, I guess. We also saw some interesting behavior, some headbutting. I like this photo, except that the bottom is sort of slightly cut off. My fault. In this photo, we have a skinny whale up at the top, a worrisomely skinny whale, a young adult female. 3 normal-sized killer whales below her, and 1 little baby as well. And then just mostly cut off at the bottom, you can see another animal. That's a pear-shaped whale. This is a pregnant female. You can just see in this photo, I think, that her weight, her maximum width is behind her saddle patch, at the back of her saddle patch, and this is a sign of pregnancy. So this was one of the first photos that we took in our little August field study this year, and we realized right away that this was going to be a useful method. This is a male that's starving, A37. He's a well-known member of the northern resident community. He's just like a tadpole. He's got this terrible depression behind the head. Now, he's actually so thin you would actually be able to see it from a boat. But this is what he looks like from the air. His body's tapered behind the saddle patch all the way to his tail. And he's using his great big pectoral flippers to try to hold himself up when he came up to breathe. He's got so little lipid left that he's very dense and quite feeble. So getting to the surface and breathing was a struggle for him. And sadly, he died a few days, or went missing, presumed dead, a few days after we took this photo. Here's a little video of what it looked like. So I guess the bottom line is, I think this technique of photogrammetry is going to be very useful. Use from the air is going to be a very useful way for us to gauge the health of these populations over time. It's a tool that's simple enough and cheap enough. We could do it every year, and it would give us a very good sense of how the whales are doing in that year, whether they're suffering from reduced food availability, what the pregnancy rates are. And advice from a study like this could be used by fisheries managers to make decisions about sort of local closures of fisheries in bad years. So it's dead simple conceptually, and it's got some geek appeal because it's a cool little helicopter. But it's the kind of thing that's so obvious that I'm sure we would have been doing it 25 or 30 years ago if we just had the tool to do it, and it's going to be very, very useful, I think, in our future research. So I guess the overall conclusion, looking back over the last 40 years, it's been a wild ride. We keep on thinking as scientists working in this field that we're going to run out of questions, and boy, we never do. Every time we have to answer a question, we have 5 new ones. So it's going to be, there's lots of opportunity for future marine biologists to come along and take over and see where the study leads us. But in the process, killer whales have gone from one of the most poorly understood mammals on the planet to one of the best. And this happened without anybody really noticing. It wasn't any particular day, as I referred to at the beginning. It's just something that happened. And they seem terribly impractical to study these animals, but I'm glad we did. And we're looking forward to where things go from now. So thank you. I don't know. Why do people do it? The question was, can I speak to why killer whales were butting heads? No, it's a good question. I think one of the things that was really obvious looking at them from above was that they're very, very tactile. They're constantly touching each other, they're constantly playing, they're rolling around. We only saw that head butting once, but I think it was just, we saw lots of pushing and shoving and, generally interacting in a very physical way. And I think that was just one case of it. But I guess the bigger question is, why are they so tactile, or why are they, what's in it for them with this sort of this group composition? And everything that they do, really, they spread out a little bit to forage, but the rest of the time they're always really, really close together. And it seems to play a role. I mean, we can speculate anyway that it plays a role in the cohesion of the groups and maintaining these groups. And group cohesion is pretty important. If everything that you do and everything that you learn about as a youngster is learned socially. These guys have a really low reproductive rate. They don't start reproducing until they're, say, 13, 14, 15 years old. Females go through menopause. They can't make many mistakes. They have one calf at a time. Life is precious, and life seems to be maintained best in these very tight social groups. Yes, go ahead.
What about the apocryphal story of a big whale actually finding the contents of its stomach with a moose or a land-based mammal? The mainland to Vancouver.
Yeah, there was a story from Alaska of killer whales attacking moose, and at least one moose being killed and eaten. I take that with a grain of salt, to be honest. There's lots of stories, of, interesting anecdotes out there, some of which I find frankly unbelievable. Others I propagate because they happen to me. What makes it surprising to me, that observation, is that these animals seem to have such a strong idea of what food is. And they don't, the notion that you have resident killer whales starving to death because Chinook salmon are down in abundance when there are other fish, let alone marine mammals, out there to eat, really indicates that there's got to be, the high premium on this diet, a high evolutionary premium, if you like, on being very, very selective. And it doesn't seem to me that they'd experiment very much with eating other prey. Big killer whales do harass other creatures sometimes. They go and check them out. And sometimes it's really hard to know what they're eating and what they're just harassing. But anyway. I think I should probably let Chad speak, and we'll all be able to answer. If there are any more questions, we'll all be able to address them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Lance. Well, thank you again all for coming, and thank you for hanging in there to the very bitter end. We're going to go from one of the best studied mammals and cetacean that we know the most about into another realm of questioning some of the future research that we're doing here at the aquarium and by our colleagues at Fisheries and Oceans in Canada and other NGOs along the coast. And not only that are we going to talk about anything but killer whales, we're going to try to pair them up with some of the conservation concerns that exist for all cetaceans, not just killer whales and all BC, and not just BC whales either, but some of these worldwide trends. But try to use some examples that we have here of conservation concerns in BC and research that's being done to counteract or support them. And so that's how all this slideshow is set up. So in general, I'll try to present the conservation concern and then follow it up with a research activity that's kind of being done here locally to address some of these things. All right, so the major conservation concern for most of BC's cetaceans and the worldwide ones is their low population numbers. And that's just a reflection of a historical whaling. So really the number one conservation concern for almost all cetaceans in BC is their population status and their numbers. So again, just recovery from whaling, and we're going to use the example because Tess addressed it earlier on, that BC sei whales were incredibly impacted, and in fact, you can hardly ever find one in BC these days. Sighting reports are incredibly rare, and they're even harder to verify. In this example here, you've got 4,000 records. So these are 4,000 confirmed sei whales that were in BC waters at one time, somewhere between 1908 and 1968. So roughly 60 years that they were out there, and you basically can't find them here anymore. Now this figure is pretty complex, so I'll just walk you through it a little bit. The red dots are all of the confirmed whaling locations over those 60 years, and the green dots in places like Naden Harbor, Rose Harbor, Cole Harbor along the coast are whaling stations from the past, and the size of the circle is reflective of how many whales were taken from each one of those particular locations. And then the bar graph at the bottom just simply has number of animals caught and then time on the very bottom. And you can see that there was a few animals taken in the 1920s through the 30s. There's a big gap there. Part of that is World War II. And then it starts to increase again afterwards, and you see that big spike sort of in the late 50s, early 60s, and that's when they ran out of blue whales and fin whales to hunt. So there's a huge spike, and then they wiped out the sei whales in BC as well, and the fishery collapsed, and that was the end of it. So in total, there was 25,000 whales taken from BC waters pretty much in just under 60 years. So there you go. So nowadays, the only time that there's usually a whale death, it becomes a bit of a local to-do. So in this case, this is a humpback whale that came ashore in just south of here, Boundary Bay. This was 2012, and lots of people out to check it out. Eventually, these animals necropsied. So we learned a lot in the early days from whaling, and luckily we don't have to rely on slaughtering thousands of them anymore to sort of get our information. That last example is something close to shore, sort of, lots of people around, very close to a populated area. That's not usually the case when you have a dead whale. Usually it floats up in some inaccessible place, middle of nowhere. You don't have a great big team or heavy equipment to do it, and it's usually sort of local lighthouse keepers that are available to go out and collect a modicum of information that you can get from it. We're lucky in BC to have the Animal Health Department out in Abbotsford, which is a provincial-run organization that has a specialist there who's dabbled on the side in a lot of marine mammal works and has become internationally recognized for it, and is able to sort of direct people like this lone individual here. But nowadays we're interested in sort of how many whales are left, and that's the biggest, if our biggest conservation concern is how many are there, well then we really need to get out there and figure out how many whales of different species there are. So here we're talking about population surveys and abundance. And it's best done by ocean-going vessels, or at least when you're getting in terms of abundance like this one. This is the John P. Tully, DFO's science vessel, and it's commandeered every couple of weeks out of every year to do a winter survey and a summer survey for cetaceans, particularly those that are listed as species at risk. And so much like an aerial survey that's done, you have lots of people observing, in this case binoculars staring at all the time. You have a really good idea of how many hours people are sort of staring out at the water hoping to see something other than the waves. And you combine that with a very detailed track of where that ship has gone and the distance that it's traveled, the number of hours that it's spent sending around. You can do some math and you can get sightings per kilometer, which then you can turn into population estimates for every species that you've seen along that track for that particular area. Now you wouldn't want to take it just one time. These are done multiple times over the year, over many years, to kind of get an idea on population number, the variability in the numbers, and then any potential trends you might be able to see. Another way that you can look at this kind of information sort of is less on population abundance, but on population distribution, sort of where they're located in the province, is done probably most effectively by our in-house BC Cetacean Sightings Network. So that's a collaborative project between Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Vancouver Aquarium, and we curate the database here on site between Tess and myself. It's a citizen science program, which takes advantage of the fact that not everyone has a John P. Tully cruising around, and it really distributes that that effort over a variety of people. So we've been crowdsourcing long before it was cool. And that's because our network is over 3,000 observers strong at the moment, and the best part is anyone can join, anyone can be a part of the project. We've got a lot of people that come from the BC ferries, pleasure craft operators, the fisheries, boat captains, other DFO cruises that aren't necessarily tasked to science, that are out on research and patrol, coastal residents. Lighthouse keepers are some of our best observers, as well as just coastal residents, people who live on the water, people who are hiking along the edge of the ocean, paddlers. Anyone can join. Tess showed this on before. This is the entire BC Cetacean sightings days from now through just last year. We're now currently up to about 80,000 sightings, and that includes one of every of those 23 cetacean species or populations that we have here in BC. We also have an honorary cetacean in our group, or we've got 3 sea turtles, because sea turtles on their own just can't hold their own sightings network, so we've taken them in as cetacean orphans. Now, the best part is that we turn this data around and it's used for multiple research and conservation projects every year. So the federal government is responsible for creating management plans for species at risk, and we've become sort of a clearinghouse for this kind of data because it's just not collected anywhere else. It just can't be. It's just not economically feasible, and we do it through the people of BC. One thing that we are trying to do now that our database has sort of reached sort of that 75,000, 80,000 plus number is to try and get an idea on where at least there are hot spots in the province. So we're not necessarily looking at abundance per se, but we want to know where most often we'd find cetaceans. And so the graph here that's up here first is raw data. So you notice there's huge red clusters in and around where there's lots of population centers, and that makes perfect sense. Where there's people, you'll see whales. But the green areas, we don't know if that's just because people don't venture out there very often, or is there in fact no whales there? And so we're doing some fancy math that I can't take credit for, to kind of come up with some of these areas and correct for those areas of green and take into account who's looking at, who's reporting for us, where they're there, how often do those particular groups are there, and kind of back correct our data to see where you might have some hot spots in the province. So right now this example is from killer whales, which is still probably the most numerically abundant type of sighting in our database, and you can see some hot spots that are correlated with some of these cetacean surveys that are done on the Tully and other vessels. So the east side of the Queen Charlotte Islands or Haida Gwaii, the northern part of Vancouver Island, Johnson Strait, sort of classic northern resident territory, in and around the San Juans where the southern residents tend to hang out. So we think we're doing very well, and we're eager to try this with other species at BC. So another major conservation concern is vessel disturbance. Now this is sort of acute, one-off events where you have individual vessels that are in the way that are approaching whales. This can be sport boats, sport fishing boats, individual recreational boat owners, anyone along that line. And it's a real problem that you could potentially interrupt a lot of natural behaviors, resting, feeding. A concern that I'd never really considered before joining this group is the effects of exhaust that boat exhaust has on these animals. They don't have the same kind of adaptations that we have to deal with pollen and a variety of things. So their mucous membranes are not well suited to filtering out any kind of pollutant. And so they take this stuff in directly, which is pretty nasty. The next one is interference with passive acoustic monitoring. I don't know if that's disturbance for the whales or disturbance for the researchers that are trying to listen to them with their hydrophones, but it's pretty, the kind of noise that you can have, I'll bring up in another slide. And then the last one is it increases the chance of ship strike, which is actually really is a concern all of its own. So this is an example here of a humpback in BC, and you notice there on the back, those 3 ridges, those are prop marks from this whale being struck by a propeller. And obviously this whale has continued to go on and do quite well, but you have no idea how many other animals might be out there that are struck and eventually succumb to these kind of wounds. But luckily, even though there's not a ton of research being done on them, besides what we can do with the sightings network data and a variety of other things, is that we have a tool out there, at least an education tool that we try to promote through our programs called the Be Whale-Wise Guidelines. And these were developed by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, by NOAA in the US, and was guided through the process by commercial whale watchers that were trying to police themselves. And really, it's got 3 sort of components to them. I'll back up. It has a speed component, a location component, and a positioning component. So really, 3 basic rules. The first is to stay out of the path of the whale. So try not to position yourself immediately in front of the whales, or leave your vessel sort of parked, zoom up right in front and cut the engine and let them swim underneath you. The idea is to stay to the side. Another one is to reduce your speed, slow down to less than 7 knots. Try not to charge in on them. And the last one is to always stay at least 100 meters away from marine mammals. And in the US, that's right, it's 200 yards, thank you. And the last one is not encouraging dolphins or porpoises to bow ride. As Tess said, we've got some species in BC, particularly Dall's porpoise, that are that are really fantastic. They like to come in close to boats, and they'll do it on their own. You don't necessarily have to bait them to do it. And if they choose to bow ride, then things we'd like to mention to mariners and people that are watching online is to maintain your course and speed and let them dictate when they want to be next to you. So a major conservation concern, and an emerging one for the BC coast, and one that we're trying to get ahead of from the research side of things, is to deal with ocean noise. And in particular, I'm going to use an example here of commercial shipping. So there's been increased shipping in BC, or particularly in the port of Metro Vancouver. Last year it handled 135 million tons of cargo, and that's up 9% from last year, and that was 9% from the year before. So it's a steady trend in BC. It's positioning itself as a major port in the Pacific Rim. That has to do with container traffic, coal. There's all sorts of potential for liquid natural gas on the North Coast, potentially pipeline traffic. And the problem with massive shipping noise in these kinds of ships is that it becomes pervasive. It almost sort of increases the overall background noise of the ocean, which is already a fairly noisy place, and has the potential to block communication and other important activities. So I'm going to play a sound clip that has been loaned to us by one of the NGOs on the Central Coast, Orca Lab. And it gives you an idea of a couple of killer whale calls. I guess I'm a liar. There are some killer whales in this section. As they're busy trying to communicate, and then interrupted by boat noise. Well, I guess we're having some technical difficulties. It's not going to come along. There we go. And here comes the call that a day. And you could almost, it's really sad. You can hear in the middle of that passage them try to sort of increase their vocalizations to get over the noise, and then they just give up. And they just go quiet. And they've just had enough. Okay, so one of the ways we're looking at the ocean noise factor, sort of the ability to monitor things in the cool, is to create a hydrophone network. So there's currently a series of existing and proposed hydrophones. A lot of NGOs have been interested in noise or tracking whales in their own backyard for the last 20 years. And so you have this sort of de facto set of instruments that are already along the coast. And the trick is to take them from where they are now, which is where sort of pollution monitoring was maybe 50 years ago, where you had individual companies or individual counties and cities looking at different parameters, using different types of instruments, looking at different things. And they wanted to know, what they were only concerned about was their backyard, and they had no ability to create a common set of standards and to look at things that way. And that's exactly what they're hoping. And of course, that changed, and everyone's looking at the same thing. They're trying to do the same thing now with the hydrophone network along the coast. And our research associate here, Kathy Heisey, is leading that charge in trying to convince these different groups to look at the same parameters, to have their instruments calibrated, so you can create a monitoring network that sort of looks at existing conditions right now, potentially before shipping increases, and create a baseline on what the conditions are right now. We're doing something very similar here at the Vancouver Aquarium. We're looking at not the noise in the environment, but noise as how it relates to hearing. And so that's the second half of the equation. Is we can do something like monitoring the noise in our pools, which we do as a matter of fact, for our husbandry and the animals here in the collection. But we also have the ability to look at the other half, which is what do the animals hear? What is their perception like? And so we've all of the animals here at the aquarium have been part of hearing studies over the last couple of years. In all of these cases where they're collecting audiograms. So this is very similar to when you have a hearing test done, or the mobile hearing booth pulls up at your office, and you go into there and they give you the headphones, and we have the ability to sort of answer yes and no with the thumb presses. As they change the frequencies and change the volume, eventually you can't hear it anymore. And it's a very similar thing that's being done here with all of the animals, except we're doing the sort of the quick and dirty method, looking at it physiologically. We're not, you can go through the training process and train them up to answer yeses or nos and when they've heard various tones. But a quick way to do it is to do it this way, where you have attach a hydrophone or a microphone to their jaw, and of course these animals hear through they receive sound through their lower jaw. It's filled with oil, and that makes it a very good sound receiving source. They don't have external ear flaps like we do, or like some of the pinnipeds do. So we put these jaw phones on them, and the sound is played directly to them and then is relayed back to them. So essentially, we're using some of the animals here in our collection to answer questions about what those perceived levels might be. So here's an example of cetacean sound reception in general. And on the left, we've got our porpoises, Jack and Daisy, that came to us through the Marine Mammal Rescue Program. And on the x-axis, we have time, and that's in milliseconds. And the very start of those red lines is the instantaneous sound. So it's almost like a little click that gets produced for them. And then this is the response that's seen in their auditory nerve through those little suction cups that were on the back of the animals. And so that's what we received. And that's a very typical sort of mammalian response. You can clearly see that they heard something, and you chain us, and then you can do that so those are the waves that indicate the activity in the center of the brain. And we can do it with the belugas. And on the bottom, our older animal, our oldest female, Aurora, has a very standard sort of curve. And above is her daughter, Keela, who has a not nearly as significant a response. And so there's a potential that she doesn't hear as well as her mom does. And it's anyone's guess as to why that's the case, but it is really interesting to know that not all animals out there have pristine hearing to begin with. So that's part of so we have one example here of a very specific tone that's being played, and there are responses to it. But you can put a whole series of these together, and eventually you get a hearing curve. You're looking at different frequencies. So on the x-axis on the bottom, you're looking at pitch, essentially. So you can imagine sort of playing different keys on the piano, sort of going from low to high. And then on the y-axis is volume. And this always takes a really long time to figure out how to read these curves, because the lower the line, the better is your hearing is at a certain pitch or a certain key, a certain frequency. So in this area here, the dashed line is a previous line from the only other time this has ever been looked at. Is a couple of older animals in Europe. And then our aquarium porpoises are all of those various lines beneath them. And the lowest spot is the region of best hearing. So that means that they can hear those sounds at the lowest possible volume at that particular frequency. So it's pretty interesting stuff. And it shows here that, I think people's idea of what a porpoise could hear was well off, when you've got different animals that you can look at. And so all of those lines being below the dash line indicate that our porpoise hearing, young animals, was much different than what was previously published on porpoises. So another major conservation concern getting back into the field is entanglement. Now, when we're dealing with mysticetes, or these large whales, it's far more challenging to research ways in which they do them. Most of the research that goes into it deals with gear modification, changes to fishery practices, monitoring during fisheries openings, those kind of things. But in BC, we have a really great mechanism that if you do happen to see an animal that's in distress, particularly a large animal that's in distress, you have the ability to report it to the BC Marine Mammal Response Network. And this number will be part of a slide that's made available online, so everyone can have access to this number. This is also the DFO radio room, or the Fisheries and Oceans radio room, so it's manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Dealing with entanglement or potentially bycatch with some of the smaller cetaceans in BC's coast is something that we have tried to take a look at as a research community. In particular, some of the Pacific white-sided dolphins here at the Vancouver Aquarium participated in some of this work. So this is a picture of one of our white-sided dolphins wearing eye cups, and so essentially visually blind, but not acoustically blind in the pools. And you can see in the background in the light blue is a couple of lines that are hanging down. So these are weighted lines, and her task was to be able to swim around the pool and avoid these types of obstacles. And all of this behavior is being recorded through hydrophones to get an idea on what type of echolocation is used by this particular species, because they have this tool that they should be able to avoid all kinds of fishing nets, and yet they still end up in these as bycatch on occasion. I'll show a bit of a video. So that was that was net avoidance. Another thing is potentially doing finding fish or other prey in the ocean, and why do you end up in it? If you should be able to find things, if you can avoid things, you should also be able to find things. And this is a session where the trainer is working with very closely with the animal to put the eye cups on. And the eye cups are made out of gelatin. They're homemade. It's kind of great. And they dissolve after a few weeks, and Kathy, who's there on the dock, needs to make some more. So you can see the animal accepts the eye cups. There she is. And rings have been distributed around the pool, and so completely blind, she's tasked with finding these objects in the pool. And again, at the same time, the hydrophone's running the whole time, so you're able to record the type of echolocation that she's producing. And the reason why this is pretty unique for BC animals is not a lot of work has been done on Pacific white-sided dolphins anywhere. A lot of the echolocation work that was so seminal in the 70s and into the early 80s was done on bottlenose dolphins. So we're finding lots of different, while the mechanism might be the same, there's a lot of devil in the details that's different species by species. So it's becoming pretty spectacular stuff for dolphins. There you go. And the video continues on, but a very challenging spot is in the back corner of the pool of the habitats here at the aquarium. Is a little extension there, and so she was able to go and find a ring that sort of continues on through that back, but we'll skip that stretch. So some of the research that's being done particularly deals mostly with the Pacific white-sided dolphins, but I could easily see this extending to the porpoises that are here. We're looking at both at search and avoidance, and a really, really cool project that's about to get started is net discrimination. And so we talked about looking at some of the behaviors that animals do physiologically, and this is one that we're actually going to have the trainers train up for us. And it's the ability for them to answer those yes and no questions, like you were in a booth, can you see something? Or if you're at the doctor's office doing an eye chart, how far down can you go? So the idea is that we're going to change the various types of nets that are presented to them while they're visually blind, but acoustically can use their echolocation, and tell us, is there a drop-off point? Is there some kind of net that's out there that they can't see? And that would have some real implications for fisheries management. And again, that's all to help the understanding and help our understanding and behavior of the wild dolphins. And this is again led by Kathy Heisey, who's a research associate here at the aquarium. So Lance mentioned a major conservation concern for killer whales is this link between Chinook salmon runs and mortality. And so that's a really fantastic story and a great correlation, but it's not well known for very many other species along the BC coast. One way to look at sort of food supply, particularly for large baleen whales, is to conduct some coordinated studies that use some of the tools of the fisheries trade. So fisheries managers and fisheries biologists have long known that have long used sonar and various other net trawls, test fisheries to get an idea on what types of fish are out there, what type of species are there. And we plan on, it's now being used in a pilot study between the Aquarium and Hackeye Beach Institute to look at the type of prey that would be available for humpback whales in some of their feeding hotspots on the BC coast. So the first cartoon there shows a side scan sonar that's imaging fish. On the right-hand side is an equivalent idea of what you'd actually see on the monitor. You can, the seafloor is in red, the school of fish there is in blue. You could get at species depending on what they are and depending on how technically savvy you are with your sonar. You can also do net trawls to figure those kind of things out. Not only is it usually done in BC just for fish, but we're also extending it to krill, which of course is a major species that's required for some of the large baleen whales. And why they're here in the summer in BC in the first place is to really fuel up on this energy-rich food supply. A nice addition to the study was that we're looking at some of the diving of humpback whales in the vicinity of some of these schools of prey. So we had one boat that was tasked with simply doing sonar runs, and another boat that was out there trying to put dive tags on some of these large animals, which is a first for the aquarium and a real interesting step on the BC coast. They were successful. Now we did have a tag that successfully attached to this one particular individual. Able to follow it. This is along the central coast, just north of Fitzhugh Sound, up towards Denny Island and Shearwater. The big cluster of pink on the bottom is when the tag is active and is still on the boat on the end of that pole. And it's suction cupped on the end, so you can tell there's a lot of time sort of circling around, doing our best to get close to that individual. And then finally, when it takes off in a line there, the tag is on the whale. And you're following them along. And there's just a really simple example of some of the data that can come off of those instruments. If I hadn't mentioned it already, I'll mention it again. The instruments are put on via suction cups, so they only last a couple of hours. So this is a deployment that was just over 2 hours, and the black line there in the middle is the animal as it moves through the water column. On the y-axis is depth, and then on the bottom is just time. So as you go across the very top, you've got... There we go. So so this is the surface of the water. This is the animal. Actually, this is the tag still on the pole. So this is it sort of waving up and down in the air as it goes, and finally it's on the animal, and you get a sequence of dives through the whole process. And it collects a whole other variety of information: wet, dry information, light levels, and we're hoping to pair that with the surveys that were done by the boats in the vicinity of the whales to get an idea on how they're actually interacting with those prey, and not only what type of prey are they relying on, but how well that they are able to consume it. There we go. So that all looks at the amount of prey that's available to them but the other half of that equation is how much energy do you need to go through. And an example of some of the stuff that's done here at the aquarium has been looking at the energetic needs of various species. In this case, again, back to the Pacific white-sided dolphins and our colleague Aaron Rechsteiner. So we've got an animal that's in a floating metabolic dome, and it's just the frame of it in this picture, but if you can imagine it almost turned into a little tent with a clear plastic and wrapping around it. The animals are just trained to basically station, which means hang out, not be active, which is incredibly challenging to do for a Pacific white-sided dolphin. Just sort of sit there and rest in a dome. And then some very fancy equipment was brought out, and the air was drawn through it through a port, and you're seeing how much carbon dioxide they were producing and how much oxygen they were consuming. And again, some fancy math later, you end up with resting metabolic rates for a whale species, which is pretty fantastic. And again, this is sort of the gold standard that you can use. There's other ways to do it, but open circuit respirometry is considered the best and the most accurate. And they came up with a number of 15,000 calories a day required to fuel a Pacific white-sided dolphin. Pretty high energetic requirements. And so cetaceans in BC, we had a lot of conservation issues, and hopefully tried to provide you some examples of research activities that were meant to pair with them. Lots of conservation concerns in BC, and they're pretty indicative of conservation concerns for cetaceans as a whole. There's a lot of active cetacean field programs, fisheries and oceans, the aquarium. A lot of NGOs are putting their time and resources into it as well. Most of it focuses on acoustic, but there's been a little bit of energetic work, and some of that's been done primarily through the aquarium. And then I can't leave out the BC Cetacean Sightings Network because it's a catch-all for both field and office and modeling work that's done. So thank you very much. And Jonathan has some, or actually Lance has a few things to say as the closing words, maybe?
Maybe do questions first.
Okay, sounds good. Sure. So we'll open up to any questions that might be left either for myself or Lance, Tess. Carla's answering questions online, but I'm sure she'd be happy to take some. There she is. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, I haven't heard you say anything about the fisheries decline. As a conservation issue going forward must be that the source of food for the tooth whales must be collapsing or declining.
Sure. So the question or the comment is that we haven't really addressed the state of fisheries in BC in relation to its ability to support various cetacean species, in their numbers. And that's true, but that's an incredibly challenging link to make. I think the best information that's out there is the link between Chinook salmon and killer whale mortality. And even with that information, we're unable to draw any conclusions against sort of a noisy background in terms of the fluctuations that we see in fisheries. Yeah, go ahead.
Has there been any scientific results from the change in the food habitat, like taking down dams in the southern Salish Sea? Because there was a whale conference about preserving salmon in the Puget Sound area and the southern resident population. Has there been any resolution to this? Have there been any results?
Sure. I'm going to get Lance to answer that question because it actually deals with transboundary issues that he's more than comfortable dealing with.
Yeah, I think you're probably referring to those. Oh, sorry. The question was whether there were, whether the taking down of dams in the Columbia River has had a positive impact for resident killer whales. Is that a fair way to summarize it? Yeah. Well, one of the things that came out of the workshops that I mentioned was this this realization that the background fluctuation in salmon populations is greater than the annual fisheries take in the present fishery, sport and commercial fisheries for Chinook. And so one of the take-home messages for that is that habitat enhancement or conservation of the fish's spawning habitat is super important for resident killer whales. So there has been some movement there to enhance habitat for Chinook salmon, particularly in Washington State. We don't see effect of that yet, but again, we're dealing with a very long-lived, slow-reproducing critter in the case of killer whales, so it may be some time. But I think anything that increases the food supply of those, particularly the critically endangered southern resident killer whales, is got to be good. Can't be bad. Any other questions? We'll take one more. Go ahead. The question was about the overhead filming that we did of killer whales and whether there was a difference between the Biggs killer whales and the resident killer whales. The focus of that study was on resident killer whales, but we did, and so we had many hours actually of total flying time over residents. We did fly over Biggs killer whales once, and so we didn't get enough aerial footage to say much about behavior. But we could see that they were robust, but not massively robust. I thought they might be even, sort of have a greater width-to-length ratio than the residents. That wasn't the case in the 5 animals that we saw on that particular occasion. One thing that was really interesting that I wasn't expecting was that the width of their heads is quite massive. They look a bit like sculpin from the air. We know they have heavy mandibles and robust skulls. We don't know if that's environmental, if that's a result of sort of exercise as they eat and as they forage, or whether it's genetic. But we may learn about that from these photos. We could see that they've got big heads, and those big heads, there was one young animal in the group, and even that one had a wide head. So that made us think that maybe it's genetic. But that's the only thing that really jumped out at us at that one sequence of a single group. Okay.
I have an online question that I'm going to go ahead and read out. So are there any comparative studies that have been done between the St. Lawrence belugas and the belugas here at the Vancouver Aquarium?
That's a good question. There certainly has been one classic study that's used information. I'm not sure if it's comparative exactly. From the work done at the Vancouver Aquarium to sort of test questions in the wild in the St. Lawrence, and that was the work that our research associate Valera Vergara did in the course of her PhD thesis, and she looked at vocal learning, in particular the use of these so-called contact calls that she discovered the killer whales in the aquarium used to, it seems to be an affiliative behavior between females and their offspring. And the rate of contact calls go up when the animals are highly excited or stressed or separated. And so she and I actually went off to the St. Lawrence about 4 or 5 years ago and did some recording there and found that, yes, the killer whales, the belugas in the wild use contact calls as well, and that they were something that we only heard with mother-calf groups, not with all male groups. So that's one connection, I guess. Of course, we have a new ocean science pollution program here at the Ocean Pollution Science Program, I think we call it, at the aquarium, led by my colleague, Dr. Peter Ross. And Peter will be doing has done a lot of work on contaminants in belugas in the Arctic, and will be doing studies in the St. Lawrence as well. And how that links to studies here at the aquarium remains to be seen. But there is an opportunity to look at the way that our own belugas clear contaminants. We wouldn't feed them contaminants deliberately and watch them to clear, but like all animals and like humans, they're getting some in their feed. And so by comparing what their intake of contaminants and their clearing rate, we can learn about what to expect in the wild. And so we'll look forward for those studies over the next few years.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you to all of our speakers tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to wrap up this evening's class. Our next class is going to be on October 14th. It'll be the subtitle Marine Organisms class, same time. If you need to share the link for this class, you can share it probably tomorrow. It'll be up online, so you can watch this class again if you'd like. We will provide a handout that's primarily text without photos, and we'll make that available on the class webpage, so that if you're interested in looking at some of the things that were talked about tonight, we'll provide the text that was shared tonight, but not the photos for copyright reasons. And then one date that we hadn't mentioned for the class, which I just wanted to put out a save the date for December 2nd. So we're thinking about doing kind of a public program thank you event for the end of the year, and a graduation ceremony for those of you that choose to take the exam, pass the exam, and then receive your certificate of completion for the course. So I did have a copy of what the certificate will look like, and of course you can put on your resume if that's what you would like to do. So if you have any questions, you can contact me. This is my contact information up here, my phone number. I have the longest email address. Well, maybe Lance has me beat there, but a long email address to make it difficult. Please be in touch if you have any questions. Thank you very much, and we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks. Take care.